Thank you for tuning in to the Spot Burn Podcast, brought to you by Musky Fool. Join your hosts, Dan and Josh, as we ignite the hottest topics in fly fishing, answer your burning questions, and get fired up about our love for the great outdoors. Now let's get burning. We hope you enjoy the show. All right, everybody, welcome back. We got an exciting episode. Today we're going to be interviewing and talking with two very interesting gentlemen who are part of an awesome documentary. So we have Dr. Marc Gaden from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, University of Michigan, and we have Lindsey Haskin, who was the director of the film, The Fish Thief, A Great Lakes Mystery. We're going to get into this whole film, but if you haven't heard about it or you haven't seen it, absolutely worth checking out. We will plug it again at the end. We'll plug it in the show notes. This film is really about the past, present, and future of the Great Lakes through the eyes of one of the greatest invasive species we've seen in North America, the sea lamprey. But we got lots of questions. I think we're going to dig into a little bit about the film. We're going to dig into a little bit about the actual ongoing fight to kind of push back against the invasive species and keeping the ecosystem of the Great Lakes intact. And then ultimately, we're going to talk about kind of the current events on what's going on with the Great Lakes Commission, U.S., Canada, cuts to the federal budget that impacts this exact thing. So really excited to have both of you guys. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us here.
Excellent. So I guess to jump in, we just love a little bit of background. We'll start with you, Lindsey. Kind of how did you get to this point making films and get us all the way to how you started, got to the point of making a film about the Great Lakes and sea lampreys?
Well, in a nutshell, I grew up in Michigan. I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, in a town called Berkeley, Michigan. And then I went to the University of Michigan for a couple of years, and I started making money playing music when I was 12 years old. And so I always had my Hollywood dreams and everything, but I was a decent student. So I transferred colleges from University of Michigan out to Cal Berkeley. And so I moved first to Los Angeles and became a resident of California. So I lived in Los Angeles playing music in rock and roll bands and different kinds of things, and then went to school up at Cal Berkeley, and then came down to Los Angeles and kind of realized I wasn't all that into the music scene in LA especially, but I met a young lady and I ended up in Boulder, Colorado, and I started a music business there, writing and producing music for advertising agencies, for radio commercials and that kind of stuff. And I met this guy whose dad owned owned an advertising agency, and he had started a video production wing of that advertising agency. And he asked me, when I'm out selling my stuff, trying to talk to companies and things and sell my music, could I also maybe promote his video production facility? So we ended up working together, and I discovered I really liked video production, and I was a decent writer. I was a good student, so I was a decent writer and all these kinds of things. And one thing led to another, and so I was fairly successful at selling video productions and things. Just contract production, for TV commercials, for corporate videos and that kind of stuff. And I started writing them and just kind of got into it. And one thing led to another. And, so here I am. The way I got into this project was I made a 2-hour public television film about the Great Lakes that started airing. It aired for 3 years beginning in 2010. And it basically traced the history of the relationship between people and the Great Lakes ecosystem. The first half of it was how waves of people came into the Great Lakes region and used natural resources to create these amazing economies. It began with indigenous people moving into the region and learning how to hunt and fish there and survive in the Great Lakes region. And then they taught the first Europeans who came in, basically in search of fur and beavers and things. And a guy named John Jacob Astor made his fortune in the fur business in the Great Lakes region, and then moved on. He was followed by timbermen, and then came the miners and the mineral guys like Andrew Carnegie, who started the U.S. steel industry. And John, not many people realize, but the oil industry began in the Great Lakes region. John D. Rockefeller started Standard Oil. Its first headquarters was in Cleveland, Ohio, and oil was discovered in the Great Lakes region 50 years before it was ever discovered in Texas. And so anyway, that led to the car industry and the Great Lakes becoming the great industrial heartland that was the core of the arsenal of democracy that won World War II. And so the first half of the film basically tells that economic history of how Great Lakes natural resources contributed to the United States and North America, Canada as well, becoming this great industrial heartland, the most powerful industrial heartland the world had ever seen. The second half of the film was what did all that economic activity do to the Great Lakes, and how did it affect fishing? How did it affect our ability to really enjoy the Great Lakes? And then it looked at how people are trying to put the Great Lakes back together to become something resembling what they were naturally. And so this story about the sea lamprey was a small part of that story. And Marc and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission helped me amazingly to tell that part of the story, as well as other parts of the story. They introduced me to people around the Great Lakes region, to scientists and engineers and government people who were working in the Great Lakes. And so I developed a great working relationship with Marc and other people through Marc. And when the film was done, Marc said, "Hey, you did a great job with this." A couple of years later, he said, "Well, would you be interested in telling telling our story?" And I said, "Of course I would." So it was a wonderful opportunity. I was flattered and honored, to be offered that opportunity to make this film, and so here we are. That's how it came about.
That's awesome, and I think very near and dear to our heart as a fishing brand, in Wisconsin, in the Great Lakes. It seems like all the good PR goes to the Rockies and Yellowstone and British Columbia. And, I think the way we've always felt and kind of the core ethos to Musky Fool and the Musky Fool community has been like, this is the greatest, this is the beating heart, the headwaters of the biggest freshwater lake system, the headwaters of the biggest river system, biggest vein and artery. And it's exciting. That's what was so exciting to hear that story, because growing up in this area, it's not very obvious,
Yeah, I grew up in the Great Lakes region. I grew up ice fishing. I grew up fly fishing on rivers in the Great Lakes region. I grew up bass fishing, perch fishing, all kinds of things on the Great Lakes. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And from a young age, I really knew how important fishing is to people across the political spectrum, across the socioeconomic spectrum, across all ethnic groups, all racial groups. Everybody fishes. They're fishing crosses all of the boundaries or the obstacles that we have, socially. But it's something that joins us all together as a love of fishing and a love of the Great Lakes.
I've known Lindsey for a long time. I did not realize actually we went from advertising jingles to sort of telling a fish story of the Great Lakes. So a little bit more about your biography. But I grew up in southeastern lower Michigan as well, and really spent my whole life on the Great Lakes, mainly on sailboats and fishing. And very fortunate to have a career that's focused on Great Lakes restoration, because I agree completely. These are incredible freshwater resources, 20% of the world's surface freshwater. And then I'm work for the organization that's in charge of the fishery of that largest freshwater body of water on the planet. And we do a lot of work communicating to politicians and the powers that be on why we need to take care of this resource and do everything possible. And one of the stories that I wanted to tell, as Lindsey talked about, was the stories of people who fish the Great Lakes, whether it's recreationally or commercially, subsistence in the tribal fishery, and so on. And one of the ways to tell that story, as well as sort of the ups and downs of the Great Lakes fishery since the time of European settlement. And then one of the common threads as well was the mother of all insults to the Great Lakes, and that was the invasive species, the sea lamprey, which really upended everything by the mid-20th century. I'm a historian by training, and we wanted to tell this story as much as possible in the first person, but really dive into the archives as well to get the full picture of this. And Lamprey is a compelling story about what could happen to a fishery if you let invasive species into it. What I really liked about the way the film, as it progressed, was Lindsey certainly captured the desperation of the time and why we needed to do something about the sea lamprey. But it turned out to be a much more positive encouraging, optimistic story as well, because as Lindsey will talk about, I'm sure, as we continue through this conversation, it is a story of human ingenuity and making sure that we solved an existential problem in the Great Lakes, and really what the scientists did to do that more than 70 years ago, that to this day has saved the Great Lakes fishery. It's an amazing story, just an amazing story.
Yeah, it truly is, and we will get deep into it. But I'd love, Marc, to take a step back and kind of ask you the same question. How did you end up where you are? How did you trace us back? From our view, one of the most important fish and wildlife agencies. I don't even know if you consider it that, but like when the Great Lakes Fishery Commission was put together, that was hugely important. And yeah, give us a little background.
Certainly is unique. The people of Canada and the United States did not work very well together at all for most of our history, certainly over the Great Lakes fishery. Today we take for granted, and is put out in stark relief with what's going on geopolitically with the Canada-U.S. relationship, but we take for granted the really close relationship we have across the lakes that we share with Canada. But for most of the history of the Great Lakes fishery, we did not cooperate and work well together. You have 8 Great Lakes states, province of Ontario, numerous tribal and First Nation authorities on the lakes, and everybody doing their own thing. Fish don't observe the political boundaries, and what you do on one side of the lake will have an effect on the other. And it made no sense to have 8 states with wildly different, often fishing regulations, and the province of Ontario with wildly different philosophy compared to the jurisdictions on the U.S. side, and pretty much an open access resource well into the 20th century, early 20th century in terms of the harvest of that fish. A binational commission in the late 1890s knew then what we know now, and that is you have to actually have some order to things, or the commercial fishing industry would just fish the fishery down, move on to another species. By the late 1800s, the fishery was pretty industrialized. You had great advances in things like refrigeration and transportation. And overly lethal fishing gear was recognized as well. Lots of pollution from sawmills in particular. And then as the 20th century got going, industrial pollution. That's the story that we have. By the late 1800s, the binational commissions were noting the severe declines in many fish species, and also the lack of science. So it was an excuse not to do anything if you didn't have any information. And also then growing concerns over a lack of will to coordinate and communicate and talk across borders. That was sort of the state of things, and what led to numerous attempts to create a commission like the Great Lakes Fishery Commission to try and change the course of that, instead of ignoring each other and worse, working at cross purposes to actually march in the same direction.
Was there one moment that tipped the balance to we have to do this? I don't recall, but obviously in that period, the shipping containers and the we were figuring out how to get over get all these containers all the way up to Superior. But do you know if there was one moment that everybody finally said, okay, we need to get together and
There were a couple of moments that are worth noting, and I'll take us right up to Lamprey, the invasion there. But 1897, a binational research commission of Canada, the U.S., noted that the severe declines in fish like Atlantic salmon, which was a key species, was something that we should be very concerned about. They produced a report, and that was an important watershed moment that basically said, hey, you better work together or we're going to have nothing to manage. That was widely ignored. Then another watershed moment about 1925, the Cisco population, and this is talked about in the film, collapsed suddenly and almost wholly, entirely. Cisco is a type of whitefish that is a prey fish, but it's also a fish that was supporting very lucrative and important commercial fisheries at the time. So that collapse led to some early attempts to establish permanent scientific capacity in the Great Lakes, which I think was very important. Then in 1942, another binational board did a major inquiry of Great Lakes fisheries and concluded that we continued to fiddle while Rome burned, and also a lack of coordination across borders was necessary if we were going to save the fishery. Another watershed moment, that report, again, widely ignored because there was not a lot of will to kind of curb the activities of the commercial fishing industry. The real watershed moment was the lamprey invasion. There's no doubt about that. The sea lamprey were first seen in Lake Erie in 1921, but didn't really reach a critical mass in the upper lakes until about 1940. And then as the 40s progressed, and this is again captured in the film, the people who were fishing the Great Lakes watched this invasion happen in utter horror. They knew what was coming because, you'd see what was happening in, the southern part of, Lake Huron as the streams would suddenly be chock full of these lamprey spawning. And the fish coming out of the lakes would look like Swiss cheese because of the lamprey wounds that were on them, bloody Swiss cheese.
That was such a compelling part of the film when
Yeah.
you talked. I think it was you were kind of showing the first sighting and the first. Man, if you've never seen this before and you just see a pod of sea lampreys spawning or a fish coming out of the water covered. I mean, we catch them in the rivers and the brook lampreys, and it's still like very jarring. And I can't imagine. It felt like an alien invasion probably at the time.
I think that one of the most compelling scenes in the film, and we had to animate it because we didn't have any pictures, and
That's
it
the
happened
one I was thinking of. Yep.
time ago. Yeah, where they knew it was coming, and this was a long time commercial fishing family, the Syvertsons up in Duluth, and in those days they would go off and fish maybe for a couple weeks at a time while they fill up the holds and then come back and process the fish. And there wasn't, certainly no cell phones, and in those days, we're talking about the early 1940s. And the person who was interviewed, his father would be off fishing Isle Royal for days on end and communicate by mail, a letter back to the family. And he comes in, he must have been a little kid at the time because he was interviewed in the film, and finds his mother crying at the dinner table. And, what's wrong, Mom? And basically said, just got a letter from your father. The lamprey have arrived at Isle Royal. And it's an indelible image, certainly in the mind of the person we interviewed. But it also tells me they knew what was coming. And if it was important enough to write back home and say, the lamprey are here, and enough to bring your family to tears over it, it's certainly indicative of really how devastating of a threat that this invader posed to a way of life of people in the region. That was a very compelling story. That's what we wanted to tell as much as possible in the first person.
And that makes sense from the perspective of being in Duluth, because it's like they made it all the way up here.
Yeah.
They got through every barrier. I guess taking a step back for you, Lindsey, talk about the moment, and maybe Marc weigh in too. I don't know how this all worked out, but talk about the moment when I don't know, did Marc convince you to do the film, or what inspired you to kind of tell this story? Because this was not, we do some media projects. We go out there with our GoPros and we do a little bit of this, and that's a lot of work. But this is a huge
massive undertaking, an 8-year project. Where do you even start?
You got J.K. Simmons to narrate it. Like, what was the moment that you guys were like, all right, let's do this? And what inspired you to kind of dedicate so much time to it?
Well, I love the Great Lakes. Even though I live in California now, I still spend a deal of time back there. But Marc came up with the idea to do this. This is all his doing, and so he should get all the credit for this. But he put together this oral history project that the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Marc came to me and he said, "Look, this story is starting to go away. The people who were involved with this are starting to pass away, and we have one opportunity to tell this story. And so, if we're going to do this, we want to do it now." And so he was able to work out the economics of the project, and then basically assembled a team of people that worked on the project, including a post grad who was had done sea lamprey research, and he knew the subject very well. And Marc basically hired him and turned him loose. He went around the Great Lakes region to just basically be the point man, to be the scout, to find out how many people are out there, where can we find them, and how lucid are they still? Are these people who we could include into a documentary film? So he worked for about a year. One of the first year of the project was him just going around with a small little camcorder, filming interviews that were going to be part of this archive that the Great Lakes Fishery Commission put together, that will be there as part of this oral history project. So then from his work, we sat down and said, okay, well, who's available, who's here, and what, who can we get? And then we just decided to start. This project started off very differently from any other kind of a documentary film that I would do, because normally we do the research and then we'd go come up with the story ideas, and we come up with some shooting plans, and we come up with a script, and we come up, or at least a shooting outline or something like that. But we after Corey, his name is Corey Brandt, he appears in the film. He was the guy that did the research. After he came back, some of the people that he had interviewed were already passing away. So, Marc basically made the decision, look, we got to hit the road here, and there's no time to develop a script or this kind of a thing. We just have to get going. And so the first 2 years we're driving around all over the Great Lakes region, just filming interviews and seeing what we got. And then I was able to take the transcripts from those interviews and start developing the script and putting the story together and building from there. So the first thing that we did was just go out and make sure we got as many people as we could. And if you recall from the film, the first page of the credits is an in memoriam of people who appear in the film who have since passed away. So I think Marc can talk more about this, but the main motivation was that people think the sea lamprey problem has been solved, that it's past history, and that so many people are coming out of college and going to work for the Great Lakes Fishery Commission or for other fisheries organizations, and that they don't know this story, and they don't know how bad it was at that time. And so it was important to get that first person perspective from both the people who did the research and who did the work, trying to figure out a solution for this, but also people, who were there first person from the fishing families who saw the devastation that, like as Marc was talking about, Mr. Sievertson, whose mother, recalls his mother getting a letter from his father about how bad things were, and the implications of that for the fishing families on Isle Royal and in Lake Superior. And Lake Superior was the last place the sea lamprey had gotten to. It had already wiped out all of the lake trout and basically wiped out the commercial fishing industries in Lakes Huron and Lakes Michigan by then. So anyway, that's how it all started. And then we just started running around and doing all this kind of stuff. And as we were traveling around and doing interviews and everything, we were stopping in historical societies and museums, places, looking for images. And everybody we interviewed, we asked, do you have any old pictures that we can, consider using in the film? And so it was just this massive collection thing that went on for a long time. And as you guys know, being in Madison, Wisconsin, it's not great filming outside for a large portion of the year. So that was one of the reasons why the project went on so long, is, for half the year, the only thing we can shoot is interviews inside and maybe some laboratories or something like that. But out in the field, we gotta wait for some good weather to be able to go out and do that. So.
And Marc, to you, so I'll just say it. Maybe you don't feel this way, but it's kind of bold for a Fish and Wildlife Agency to, first of all, take the budget. This costs money. This costs real money, and to, really put it towards telling a story. You don't often hear that. It usually goes into research and management. And where was that? Where did you kind of grab onto that and be like, this is what we need? Because now it just looks like, especially with what's changed in the last 5 years, thank God that you guys put this together. As you said, these people wouldn't be alive, and we almost feel like we need this story now more than ever. So where did that come from?
Yeah, I have to hand it to my commissioners. I answer to commissioners who are appointed by the President and the Privy Council of Canada to run this program. We have a research theme that also includes the human dimensions of fisheries. So there actually is room within our science program, social science in this case, to do this kind of work. and put together a proposal to the commissioners and said, we have to understand our own history if we're going to be able to continue to do what we do. As I said kind of in the outset, part of my job is to communicate the vastness and the value of the Great Lakes to policymakers. It's a $5.1 billion, that's with a B, annual fishery. And the policymakers want to know the value of that fishery. Part of doing that is to remind folks what happens if it goes away. And the best evidence that we have of that is what happened before lamprey control even began and how much we lost in that. So it really is relevant to today, and it was not much of a sell to the commissioners to say the best way we can tell our story is to make it clear to folks what it was like before the lamprey invasion existed. And Lindsey's right. We go talk to thousands and thousands of people every year at outdoor shows and at conferences. And a lot of times you do get the lamprey control. I thought that problem went away, 70 years ago. And in some respects it did, because as the film talks about, we discovered ways to control lamprey selectively and effectively in the Great Lakes. And the lamprey populations have been reduced by about 90 to 95%, which is unheard of anywhere in the world for an invasive species program, especially a species this destructive and that wide of a range, using a selective control method. We also make the point it's really easy to kill fish, as you could put rotenone in the river and achieve your objectives, but you're going to kill everything. It's really hard to kill what you're after. The other thing that really convinced the commissioners to embark on this is we're not oblivious to the fact that we do have a social license to do what we do. And that is the two main control methods for sea lamprey is a pesticide, which we talk about the discovery in the film, and the use of physical barriers, which we don't talk so much about in the film, but there are dams all over the place, most of which we had nothing to do with, that actually do serve a purpose for invasive species control. And that's a good thing. They block the movement of harmful species and fish disease, like VHS. But what we don't know is what's society's acceptance of these two control methods on an ongoing basis. If you don't see lamprey as a threat, that is, I thought that problem went away a long time ago, and you also are not keen on, say, the use of lampricides or barriers to control a species, we might have ourselves a bit of a problem. Where you lose the social license to protect that $5.1 billion fishery. Part of the purpose of the film was to remind folks of what a threat the lamprey were to the fishery, how much they changed things, and how we want to make sure we don't repeat history. Right. So that was another reason why we wanted to tell this story. And again, I'm kind of a history nerd, and I as a social scientist, I'm most moved by hearing things from people in the first person. And we interviewed a lot of folks who were, some of them pretty young at the time, but they still remembered it quite vividly because it was indelible in their minds. Like Beatrice Mertz, who in the film here, who was fishing with her father, who was a commercial fisherman out of Rogers City, Michigan, drowned, is a dangerous business, still is, drowned suddenly, and her mother took over the business. And she recalls, being on the deck of the ship, her father telling her how bad lamprey were, and her job was to make sure that, she says in the film, no live lamprey to go back into the lake. So she was a little girl, but her job was to, when they hauled in a fish with a lamprey, to stab it and make sure exactly, just chop its head off, is how she said it in the film. And these are the great surprises too. She's wearing like the number one grandmother hoodie, and talking very sweet. And she says, and my job was to chop their heads off. So that's what I love about this kind of, film.
Yeah, and we're gonna move on to talk a little bit more about the ecosystem. But you guys, I'm glad we have a hard cutoff, because I think I have a million questions for both of you. And I'm glad we're keeping this to like sea lampreys, but you made a point there, and this kind of came up in our prep. One of our employees actually brought it up. And before I heard you talk and before I watched the film, if you asked me what I thought about dam removal on the tributaries to the Great Lakes, I would have said, hell yeah. We're fishermen. We want to see those lake run steelhead and all these fish be able to swim up. And it was Tim, actually, and now you brought up the point of like, but how does dam removal affect sea lampreys? And then I think we have to now think of that. It can't just be like, get rid of all the dams. This is 100% good.
Mm-hmm.
There are implications to that. So I think that's an interesting way to think about it is, you guys have to get social buy-in for this when it comes to poisoning these areas and removing dams. And it's probably one of the more difficult parts of your job.
Well, we are certainly schizophrenic about dams, if you will, because part of our treaty, the agreement with Canada, says that we're to take steps to improve the fishery. And dams stop connectivity and they stop the movement of fish in and out of rivers. And a lot of our native species, walleye, sturgeon, suckers, you name it, benefit from going back and forth in the river. So connectivity is important. But without the dams, we would have no chance of controlling the lampreys. There wouldn't be enough lampricide anyway to do that. So, and dams are not just helpful in lamprey control, but block the movement of fish disease and other types of invasive species like round gobies, or if heaven forbid the Asian carp got into the Great Lakes, the dams would certainly thwart the movement of that. We're working on a project. And all your podcast listeners need to do is Google Fish Pass, one word, Fish Pass. It's a project being done up in Traverse City, Michigan, only place on the planet where this is being done, where we're basically going to have a research facility in a controlled environment below a dam. And for the next 10 years, as soon as the project is, the construction is complete, which will be next year, we're going to be testing technologies and techniques to sort fish automatically. So when you have a dam somewhere, you have a mixed assemblage of fish. It's a mix of, sturgeon, suckers, walleye, trout species, and then invasive bad things like lamprey that get stopped at that dam. Wouldn't it be great if you could sort those fish automatically? That would then allow you to pass the fish that you want to get past that dam and block the fish that you want to block. And it would solve the biggest fishery management challenge of our time, and that is how to create connectivity while still blocking harmful things like sea lamprey. It's a proverbial cake and eat it too.
Right.
Nowhere on the planet is this work being done. And we're looking at everything. Shape of the fish, behavior of the fish, are there pheromones that might attract a species and maybe repel another? Facial recognition, the AI gets better by the day. Underwater cameras to maybe sort the fish. It's inspired by recycling, where you throw all of your recyclables in one bin, glass, tin, paper, you name it. And then there's, the odd tire or styrofoam that shouldn't be in there. The recycling plant uses technology to sort it automatically. You don't have people just picking the glass from the cans and throwing out the tire. Why can't we do that with fish? We think we can smarten up the dams, and that's what we're doing there. It, largely inspired by proposals to remove a dam, and we're like, well, you can't do that because you're going to create 1,000 new miles of lamprey habitat. Can we have it both ways?
Yeah, and how that theory isn't just on the Great Lakes. I mean, what were we just talking about last couple months ago about how Asian carp had made it all the way up to the Eau Claire Dam, and we're generally like, get rid of dams, but you have this phenomenon everywhere. So not only do we have to be careful, but I think every river, lake, water ecosystem will be rooting you guys on with that project, because that would have huge implications globally. Mm-hmm. My last question before I let Josh kind of move on to talk a little bit about the ecosystem and whatnot is, and really for both of you, was there I'm thinking about what you were saying, Lindsey, you guys driving around interviewing all these people. Was there that moment where that interview or maybe a couple where you guys looked at each other and were like, oh man, we got it. Like, holy cow, that story, maybe brought about some emotion. And I don't know if that happened, and if so, I'd love to hear you talk briefly about that.
Well, there are a lot of those stories. The hard thing about doing this kind of thing is we shot interviews, some of which we weren't able to use. So that's one of the my regrets about this. When we first started the film, it was going to be 1 hour long, and then I convinced Marc to let it go to 90 minutes, which I'm happy to see that it seems to be playing well, and people don't get up, in screenings and everything. So that seemed to work out okay. But there was just so many amazing stories and so many people that really conveyed the human impact of this story and how it affected their families, how it affected their economics, how it affected their futures, and so many little anecdotes about things of how people had to go into different careers, and their families lost businesses, and just the hardship that came from this, that we had to pick and choose. And so when from your question, it makes me think back to those kinds of things, about how many things we just had to leave on the quote unquote cutting room floor, that we wish we could have put in there. But the good thing about it is that for future historians and future filmmakers and future storytellers, all of these things are going to be at the Great Lakes Fishery Commission in their archives, and so.
Well, that's told, but sorry to interrupt, Lindsey, but that's told from the filmmaker's perspective. I mean, you're right, lots on the cutting room floor, but the as you're just saying, the output of this are the stories that we have now forever in the archive. So just because it didn't make it in the film doesn't mean it's not valuable, because that itself was an output. And there were a couple of stories that really compelled me as we were going around. I'm sure you remember, Lindsey, when we were talking to George Purvis up on Manitoulin Island. He's a commercial fisherman out of Meldrum Bay, which is the far western part of Manitoulin Island. Long time, he and his family. And he was saying that they would set the nets, and what they would pull it up would be heavily scarred lake trout. They were fishing for lake trout at the time that were literally rotten, because the lamprey had sucked the blood and body fluids out of them, and just leaving nothing but just a rotting carcass. And by the time they would pull the nets up, he said the boats would be, the decks would be so smelly of dead, rotten fish that you could hardly breathe there. And but what was compelling about that, besides the fact that they were pulling up just nets of dead, rotten fish, was how quickly it happened. So this was, he would basically say, like, the year before we were hauling out nets full of healthy fish and had a good thing going with the markets and all that, and just boom, how quickly the lamprey had that effect on the fishery. The same with Ralph Wilcox. He fished out of Brimley, Michigan. Ralph has since passed away, but he was really talking about, again, how quickly it changed once the lamprey had invaded. He fished his entire life. He shared with us pictures of him as a little kid, on the fishing boat, and could vividly remember that lamprey invasion, about how quickly really it changed the way of life in it. And that's why you do get stories like the Syvertsons out on the far western part of Lake Superior, really, really upset when the inevitable happened, that they made it to Iowa, because they heard from their fellow commercial fishermen really what was happening.
Yeah, another aspect of the story that I don't want to get to have overlooked, though, and a lot of the compelling stories about it were the sport fishery that was created because of sea lamprey control. If it weren't for sea lamprey control, salmon would have never been introduced into the Great Lakes. And we filmed some pretty interesting people, including the gentleman at the end of the film, a guy named Don Dubin, who's just a fishing nut. It's like really some cool stuff in there about the passion for Great Lakes fishing is there. And I don't think many people really realize that before the salmon introduction, sport fishing or recreational fishing was mostly done on inland lakes, and the big lakes were for commercial fishing. But because of sea lamprey control and the unplanned invasion of alewives and all that kind of thing, salmon were introduced into the Great Lakes, and that created this incredible sport fishing industry that rescued small towns up and down the lake shores throughout the Great Lakes on both sides of the U.S. Canadian Canadian border and created just this massive sport fishing economy and completely shifted the focus of fishing in the Great Lakes. And it was all because of sea lamprey control. And so, we interviewed a lot of people, sport fishermen who are just crazy about salmon fishing and about going out on the lakes. And, we went out with them and went fishing with them and all that kind of stuff. And, I remember doing that as a kid, going out on the Great Lakes and fishing as well. And so that's the happy ending of this story, is that that kind of happened. So,
and that's how we think about it too. Like, I mean, we make an annual trek to the Great Lakes for muskies, and we have that circle. That is the week of the year. And I mean, if you ask anglers anywhere, fly anglers, conventional anglers, where do you find the biggest muskie in the world? Great Lakes. Where do you find the biggest walleye? Where's the world record brown trout? Great Lakes. And it stirs that emotion of what could be possible. So that's
none of that would be happening without sea lamprey control.
Right.
Yeah.
And so not related so much to lamprey, because it happened before the lamprey invasion, but I was doing a little research as well leading up to this podcast. And I learned something, that is that there was a commercial up until about 1904. The musky fishery was a commercial fishery on the Great Lakes.
No kidding.
I know. And
never heard that before.
And the reason why it shifted was not so much because the muskie fell out of favor with connoisseurs, but it started becoming popular about the turn of the last century as a recreational fishery, and that's sort of where the attention turned. So this is a case where the anglers and the commercial fishers were seeking the same species, and the commercial fishery just kind of ceded it to the recreational angler. And so I've never thought of muskie as a commercial a species in the commercial fishery, but it was up until about 1904.
You might screw up this. I'm going to be careful here, Mark, because Josh and I could just ask you about that for the rest of the podcast. We'll have to take it offline because we want to focus on the film but that's very fascinating. So I
only learned that a couple hours ago, so you've exceeded. That's as much as I know. So we'll have to do more research for a future podcast.
Okay, so, excellent.
Yeah, that's mind blowing, and I can't wait to dive more into that. Right? And it's a perfect segue kind of into our next topic here as we talk about apex predators and ecosystem impact. So the film kind of discusses a lot about the lake trout being the top dog apex predator, but we as musky fools, we might have a bone to pick with that statement. Can you guys kind of talk briefly about the overall ecosystem and how it changed before the invasive species up till now?
Well, before the lamprey invasion, there were a lot of species that were sought after by anglers and the commercial fishing industry, and certainly subsistence. So lake trout for sure. Lake trout always seems to get top billing. But there was a lot of fishing for commercial fishing for whitefish was really important. Ciscos, the various species of ciscos, chubs, often colloquially called, sturgeon, you name it. Burbot. There was a commercial fishery for burbot. Burbot and lake trout are probably the two that are in most competition as the top apex predator in the Great Lakes as sort of piscivores goes. And the reason why you always talk about lamprey and lake trout in the same breath is because they tend to inhabit the same niche along with whitefish. And those are the species that got wiped out first and quickly, that were also at the same time sought after by humans. But really, the lamprey go after pretty much everything. And from the top predators like lake trout and burbot to other species like whitefish, they will kill about 30% of the sturgeon they attack. You wouldn't believe it, but the lamprey can be lethal, very lethal on sturgeon. For fish like sturgeon and lake trout that are long-lived and take many, many years to reach reproducible age, it's particularly troubling because lake trout, I think, needs to be somewhere about 8 years old before it's old enough to reproduce, and a sturgeon even longer. That's a lot of time to be evading sea lamprey. Whereas a salmon, quick and it's a shorter life that they have, and they reach reproducible age right away. It gives them time to reproduce before they get slaughtered by the lamprey. So that's also why you get, you talk about sort of lamprey and lake trout, but lamprey were lethal on a whole, just about everything in the Great Lakes. Walleye, yellow perch, if you could believe it. A yellow perch this long would have a lamprey this long on it. And they just move on to other fish. So it's very, very lethal.
Was there you made a comment there about the lake trout lamprey? Was there something about lake trout behavior where they inhabited their movements that overlapped them with lamprey a lot, or
quite a bit? Yeah, okay. Quite a bit. So the cold, dark parts of the lakes where the lamprey like it cooler, and they would have it sort of the same physical space as fish like lake trout and burbot. And I don't know if lake trout are particularly bad at evading them, like shaking them off, but lamprey, that mouth is a suction cup. It's a very strong suction cup, and the teeth in it kind of anchor on the side of the fish, and fish have very little chance of shaking it once it attaches, and lake trout particularly unsuccessful in doing that. So you could have a lake trout just get the life sucked out of it over the course of a few days, and then the lamprey will just move on to another one.
That makes sense. And why, again, from a recreational fishery, muskie and smallmouth and walleye might not be as affected. As you said, everything's affected, but just based on where they inhabit, shallower water, they're not overlapping as much as lake trout might be.
Here's another way to look at it. It's not uncommon, actually, for anglers to find lamprey attached to muskies when they catch them, but they're mostly silver lamprey, which is a native lamprey of the Great Lakes, much smaller and not the mean cousin that the sea lamprey is.
Not as lethal.
And they co-evolve, so they're part of the natural ecosystem. And maybe the silver lamprey might be having lunch and be more parasitic as opposed to a lethal predator that a sea lamprey might be. But the silver lamprey tend to inhabit the same type of habitat that the muskies do, the warmer Lake St. Clair type habitats, as opposed to deep, dark Lake Superior that the sea lamprey and lake trout like. So you will get lamprey attacking the muskies. They just happen to be the lamprey that are there naturally in the same habitat where the muskies are naturally. We don't know what sea lamprey would do. You don't see a lot of sea lamprey in Lake St. Clair just because it's not a preferred habitat for them. If muskies and sea lamprey inhabited the same habitat, I would venture to guess that the sea lampreys would be quite lethal on a muskie.
Right. So it's not like sea lampreys are like, oh no, we don't like to eat muskies, we're going to move on. They're just, lake trout and sea lampreys are overlapping much more often than most of the other species.
Yeah.
So somebody as like a non-angler or a non-Great Lakes enthusiast just coming out of the woodwork to see this film, how could you describe why is protecting these top predators so crucial today, both ecologically and culturally?
It's basically tourism. There's an economic reason about this. One of the things that I really like about this film is that it's an opportunity to tell a story that it appeals to people all across the spectrum. I have friends here in Southern California. When we finally finished the film, I rented a theater here and showed it to 100 of my friends, and they still talk about it. And it's, for two things. They say, one, they can't believe the Great Lakes. They've never been. A lot of them have never been to the Great Lakes, and they're like, what? These places. This place is amazing. The animal, I've been interviewed before, and somebody said, well, what about the sea lamprey? What's the deal with them? And I said, they're oddly charismatic, and that people are fascinated by them. Women are still horrified by them and those kinds of things. But we do screenings all over the place, and the Great Lakes Fishery Commission often sets up a table with aquaria in it with sea lamprey there, and they just draw crowds. People are fascinated by them. They get to touch them. they get to touch them and pet them, and all this kind of a thing. But most important to it is that, because of sea lamprey control, all of these small towns that where the commercial fishery was dying, and those places were already struggling because a lot of them were built during the logging era and everything. They were going down, and the reason why people should care about this is that for economic reasons and for cultural reasons, fishing is a big part of Great Lakes history. It's always, if you love the Great Lakes and you have any attachment to the water in any way, fish are a big part of that attachment, and that was going away. And so, that brought this back and made people reconnect to the Great Lakes. And now you have all these people who are, you have all these tourism towns, you have all these marinas that got built to support the salmon fishery and all these kinds of things. And so, that's what it's all about is keeping the Great Lakes there for anybody who wants to fish them, who wants to be able to swim in them, and have things be healthy. It's reconnected people to understanding that keeping the Great Lakes healthy is important for social reasons, for cultural reasons, for economic reasons, and fish are a big indicator of the health of the Great Lakes.
I love that. I think that philosophy deeply resonates with why I jumped my whole family and life into this fishing business. It's actually more interesting about the people that don't fish, getting them involved and enthused, because we seem to be losing a little bit of sight of that. And that's why I love the film like this and folks like you guys who are on that mission as well.
And
which one of you guys has a pet sea lamprey in the basement?
We have a tank of them here, so
Marc's just got him in his basement, just abusing them and telling them, no more.
Yeah, I deal with the politics as well of it, and there are certainly lots of different reasons why people are motivated to want to protect the Great Lakes. Some of it, as Lindsey said, is economics. Some of it is it's just it's deeply ingrained, like in me. I grew up around here, and I just can't conceive of things without the Great Lakes or water or fishing. We did some survey data that would demonstrate that people just like knowing that there's a healthy fishery out there, and fish are the main indicator of the health of the Great Lakes. There's you can take water quality samples and demonstrate that with the chemistry. But the simplest question is, are there fish out there? And when there aren't fish, something is very wrong. Can you eat the fish? And if you can't eat the fish, something is very wrong. So whether you fish or not, the healthy fishery really is something that's important to people. But the politicians, of course, want to know why, if you're going to be investing money in fishery programs or Great Lakes cleanup, they want to know that the money is well spent. Part of what we can demonstrate is that the sea lamprey control program is beneficial to that economy and to the local communities, and there's just something a little bit more than just the raw economics. It's sort of the way of life that we have in the Great Lakes Basin that's important. And when you talk to people, that like we did in the film, you find out how deeply important the Great Lakes and the fishery are to them. It's moving. They talk about their own stories when they were growing up, and I used to inner tube down the St. Clair River, and sometimes I would just see where the current would take me, and other times I'd want to get out of the way of that freighter or something, and sometimes kayakers would just the perfect speed for trolling or something, with a fishing rod. It just means different things to so many different people. It's very cool.
That is what's cool about it. A perfect. Oh, go ahead, Lindsey. Go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say, one of the things that kept coming up as we were filming with people is that how important fishing was in their own childhoods, but now with their relationships with their kids, that's an important way that parents interact with their children is to get them outside and fish. And there's this whole mystery of, can I get something from this, below this surface that I can't really see from, it's just this cool thing that I remember as a child. I used to go fishing with my father, and then I got into it and I started tying my own flies and doing all this kind of, stuff. But it's just kind of a rite of passage for so many families in the Great Lakes regions, from all ethnic groups, from all racial groups, from all religious groups, from all political persuasions, and all socioeconomic levels. It's just it's a thing of that of a relationship between parents, and a way that grandparents interact with their children and parents interact with their children, and those kinds of things. The social importance there, and the memories and the bonds that get formed over fishing. I think you can't talk too much about. So,
and even not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but crosses civilizations and languages, and people that live 2,000, 4,000, 6,000 miles away from us. It's crazy. It's crazy. That's what we nerd out about all the time. But Marc, you guys are really helping us with these perfect transitions.
Yes.
You talked about the politics, and I think the way I view it was like this film ends with hope, and a lot of hope. And not to by no means shatter that hope, but since then there's been some troubling news. And I think we've read the news. You're probably the most close to it person that I've had the chance to talk to, since the recent cuts to the U.S. lamprey control. I guess talk about that. How much of that is actual? What's the real impacts that you're seeing, and where does that take us into the future?
Let me start by saying that I've been dealing with the Great Lakes and the politics of it since I started my career. I started off working actually as an aide to a member of Congress from Detroit back in the late 80s, and I would work on Great Lakes and environmental issues. And the one thing I've learned over the years, in the 35 plus years that I've been working in this field, is that the Great Lakes are the most nonpartisan thing you could imagine. Fish and fisheries is political. I mean, we go to enough sport club meetings or commercial fishing things to know that everyone has an opinion on that, and there's a lot of politics involved. But what's not political is the bipartisan and long-lasting support for the Great Lakes, the fishery, and the restoration efforts that we're doing. So that is the starting point for answering your question. In fact, I'm just back from about 6 weeks in Washington, D.C., and you find no daylight between Democrats or Republicans, even in this chaotic climate, over Great Lakes restoration. That's the good news.
That's awesome.
The troubling news is that the start of this new administration has been unlike anything we've seen, and it is providing certainly some significant challenges in continuing to do the work that we do to restore the Great Lakes and to do things like control the sea lampreys. The money is there for the sea lamprey control program. We don't have any money issues. It's a very popular program because we can demonstrate the direct link between spending about $20 million to control lamprey and the $5.1 billion economic return. And the members of Congress are very supportive of that, and they remain that way.
And not to interject, but you have COVID to show what happens if you don't. If you take your foot off the gas for one moment, keep going.
And ask again if I forget, Dan, to about the COVID thing, because there's a new paper that was just published today about that. But
okay, great.
So we don't have any money issues. In fact, Congress has given us a mandate to go out there and continue to do what they're doing. Who told you to stop? Well, the problem that we have is that the delivery of lamprey control is a boots on the ground effort that is carried out by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the United States side of the border, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada on the Canadian side. It's the Fishery Commission's responsibility, but we in essence hire those agencies to do that. We have since 1956. So, we have a long-standing partnership with that. And so, while the funds are there to do the lamprey control, the bumpy chaos with respect to staffing and personnel in the government agencies has left us with significant reductions in people that are out there actually doing the work. So some were laid off. Some there was a delay in hiring. We have a whole group of seasonal employees that only work during the control season because you don't need to work year round. We control lamprey April through October. And so we hire these people on a seasonal basis, and there was a delay in hiring those. Many are taking early retirements. We've lost about 150 years of collective experience. And this isn't something where you can just go to Kelly Services and say, I need somebody to do this. They need to be certified to apply the pesticide. They need to have an innate understanding of this. We save millions of dollars a year in what we call expert judgment. And that normally you go out there with electrofishing devices and count the number of larvae in a stream to know if you needed to treat that stream or not. Some of them we just know based on years and years of experience that that stream needs to be treated, and you don't have to expend the money to do the assessment work because you have that expert judgment. Well, when you lose that expertise, you also lose the value of that expert judgment. That's the challenge that we're facing. We had members of Congress after the first wave of the layoffs that rallied, and they contacted the Interior Secretary and basically said, okay, leave these are very important people to the Great Lakes and to the control program. We're off to a slow start. We did not get all of the staff back, but we've got most of them back. And time will tell just how reduced of a control season we're going to have. But we put on the running shoes and we're going to try and get caught up. But I will say that the disruption in the early months will lead to probably less lamprey control in 2025 than we had planned.
Interesting. And I mean, I do sense that was very articulate, bipartisan, but also objective answers. So I appreciate that, because that's what we try to do. And we talk often about, like, we're not here to bring in our personal politics. We care about the fish. And like you said, the Great Lakes is a very apolitical thing. But it makes sense. And I think what I also see and hope maybe, and maybe you've seen a glimmer of this, is like they cut it and then everybody is telling them and they're like, oh, whoops. They kind of have the oops moment. Okay, that's an area where you're right. Maybe we overdid it and we can come back.
That's well said. I mean, the members of Congress heard, I think that's well said. The members of Congress heard from their constituents, and it was some decisions made at Interior to basically, this is a high priority, and there is a direct connection between the men and women who are out in the field doing this work and the economic value of the Great Lakes. And I think I really can't say enough for the members of both parties who worked very hard over the past few weeks to help us get back on track. So we'll certainly try our best to make up for lost time, and I have confidence we can. But I also can't say for certain whether we're going to be able to carry out the full number of stream treatments that we had planned at the beginning. But we'll do our level best on that because the fish depend on it.
Absolutely. And it's, all of the years and years that could be unwound if you go a few years without it. I think the other thing, I don't know, I don't want to over-index too much on this, but just hearing you talk, this might need to be a story that's broadcast more, because there's not many things right now that Democrats and Republicans are coming together on, and different states. There's not many things Canada and U.S. might be able to agree on, but it seems like this might be one of the few. And I think that glimmer of hope is much needed in today's day and age. So
I think I think, Dan, the members of Congress need to be congratulated for that, because we do, I spent a lot of time in Washington, and a lot of, especially of late, it's not all that frankly fun. And they could be debating whether the sun rises in the east and you may not get a majority vote. But on this particular case, the Great Lakes, the meetings and the conferences that we have with the members are all very encouraging and uplifting. So I don't have any doubt that that will continue. They've reintroduced the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative legislation in a bipartisan way. So that's the flagship work that everybody agrees needs to happen to clean up the legacy pollution in the Great Lakes and to control invasive species. Everyone agrees on that. And that's where we're focusing our attention right now. Where do we have areas of agreement? Why is it important to do that? At least, when I spend time, I'm not really debating with them or expending a lot of time trying to convince them why they should do it. It's just a matter of now is the time to redouble our efforts, given the challenges and the climate that we're in. And the members are rallying. It's very heartening to see that happening.
That's an important message. That's really awesome to hear, Marc. And I do, like Josh and I've said, you guys are very interesting. This is a very interesting topic. We could talk your ears off, but in the effort to keep us on time, talk a little bit about the COVID situation, I think, and take this wherever you want, but where we were coming from with this question was, COVID showed as an example what happens if you stop for a minute with sea lamprey control. And for those listening, from my non-scientific background, we turned it off for a little bit with COVID and sea lampreys came back. Not all the way, but enough to show us the importance of kind of holding the line. And then you had also obviously mentioned the COVID paper, so I just wanted to bring that back up. Please let us.
Well, had we had the data, which we're just getting now about the COVID effect, it probably would have been included in the film, frankly, as part of a demonstration about how lethal the lamprey remain. Because, as we've said a few times in this, people had thought the problem went away. COVID provided a natural experiment that nobody in their right mind would ever have dared try, and that is to ease up on control. But this is a field program. It requires taking the battle to where the lamprey are. So getting out in the field and traveling and doing the control in the streams, which is where the lamprey control is done. And certainly in 2020 and 2021, when you had major travel restrictions, it was not safe to do so. A closed border. We're a border blind Canada-US program, so that posed challenges. We did about 75% less lamprey control in many areas of the Great Lakes during that, just simply because of the travel restrictions. And so in 2020, the survivors of that field season, the lamprey survivors, come back to spawn in 2022. That's just the life cycle of that. So you wouldn't notice the effects of a shortened control effort of 2020 until at least 2 years later. So that's how the life cycle is. And then for 2021, you would get the data in 2023. So we are just now getting a fuller picture of the really reduced seasons of 2020 and 2021. As the trapping is done in the lamprey life cycle, it becomes more the effects of the curtailed treatment. And the numbers are sobering. The scientific data that we have absolutely confirms the anecdotal data that we got from the anglers of the Great Lakes starting in about 2022 and 2023, where we would get lots of phone calls and lots of comments from people who were reporting huge spikes in lamprey numbers. To give you one example, Lake Ontario, which was particularly hard hit because it's the far end of where our control crews go. So there was no control in Lake Ontario for a while. The lamprey numbers spiked 10 times what we are used to in just 2 years. It was an incredible spike in the numbers, and 100% of the fish had wounds. They were really, really hammered in Lake Ontario, and the other Great Lakes the same. So we have a paper coming out pretty much as we speak in Fisheries, which is a top journal, peer-reviewed journal, that is the first crack at documenting the science behind the COVID pause in lamprey control. And the numbers are very, very compelling. Huge spikes and very quickly. And so we got it now in the literature, and we can really demonstrate what really Lindsey was capturing in the film as well, of just what a coiled menace or a risk that this invasive species continues to inflict on the Great Lakes fishery.
I think that's an important message. We can't take this for granted.
So although the lamprey control was kind of dwindling during that COVID time, were you guys able to still forge ahead pretty well with the documentary, or did you have to step back a little bit and take some time off too?
Basically, we had to stop. We couldn't go out in the field and film. We couldn't travel ourselves. We had to deal with all those restrictions. However, it gave us the opportunity to focus on the archival aspect of the film. So we used that time to basically just dig deep into archives as much as we could remotely. And then it also gave us the time to think about the script and work on that. We had just been running around, getting, shooting, doing all the shooting. So it gave us the time to actually start crafting the story itself, and so which is still a lot of work. So work didn't stop on the project by any stretch of the imagination. We started working on the computer animation that you see in the film. We also started working on the music. It's an all original music track for the film, and so we kept that going.
Yep.
That's interesting.
Totally
And
makes sense.
probably again, like you had said, out of order of how you're used to it. So you're just just rolling with the punches a little bit.
Maximize time here. Yep.
So we want to wrap up with a couple other questions about where you guys are headed next. But I can't not ask, especially you, Marc, briefly, what's the impact of the current situation with Canada and U.S. on this? Have you felt it? Or is it more of the same? Like, I think this was one of the few things that isn't being affected. Just tell me what you're feeling on that.
Well, you can't help but feel it. It's unprecedented, really. The rhetoric and certainly the economic issues that is currently happening. The whole existence, the reason our commission exists, is to make sure that the U.S. and Canada remain on the same page and continue to talk. And to continue to pool our resources to attack a common problem and to achieve our common objectives, which is restoring and protecting the Great Lakes fishery. And it's not easy to do in this climate. I'll just say that for sure. Again, the good news, though, is that the whole value of commissions like ours that has people who are committed to working across borders, I think really shines in these types of situations where you do have lots of issues and challenges in some sectors, but not in the fisheries. Like the commissioners from Canada and the United States are not concerned with other things beyond their job, which is to work together to protect and improve the Great Lakes fishery. So I think it does really show the value of why institutions like the Great Lakes Fishery Commission are so darn important. And you try your best to disentangle it from other issues and create ongoing working relationships. It's not going to happen unscathed. We do have scientists who are reluctant to travel because of perhaps potential challenges at the border. Or not a lot of appetite right now to basically hang out in the other country, given the atmosphere. But for the most part, I really have a lot of confidence that the networks that we've spent decades building will endure. And these are people we work with, are friends and colleagues, and we've had decades of trust building. That a few bumps in the road won't destroy completely, and I hope that will help us work through that.
Yeah, and perhaps even optimistically be a building block to get us back.
Yep.
Perhaps. Very cool, very interesting. I appreciate it. I know those are the touchy subjects, but to have the opportunity to have you on and to hear about it, I think very compelling for anybody that's going to listen.
Yep. And with that, we'll move on to just a couple more lighthearted closing questions here, and then we'll relieve you guys of your duties. So what's next for both of you? Lindsey, do you got any other projects coming up for both you and Skyhound Media? And then same with Marc with the GLF.
Well, I'm looking into potential things that are out there. There's some other Great Lakes projects. I had started developing some other Great Lakes projects before this, before Marc offered me this opportunity, and so I'm looking into those again. I'm sorry?
I said love to hear that. Yeah.
Thanks. And another interesting thing that kind of came up through this is, I live here in San Diego, and we were in a film festival here. The Fish Thief was in a film festival here in San Diego, and at a lot of these film festivals, there's a panel discussion afterwards, and I get up and people ask me questions. So I was kind of concerned that maybe some people are in San Diego here are going to say, "Hey, are there lamprey off the coast of San Diego? And if I go surfing, is one of these things going to latch onto me?" So I reached out to the Fishery Commission if they could put me in touch with some people on the West Coast about what's going on with are there lamprey out here. And so it turns out that yes, there are lamprey here. There's a species called the Pacific lamprey that looks similar to the Great Lakes or to the sea lamprey that invaded the Great Lakes, but it's a different species. But as you know, in the film, there's a gentleman, a Native American gentleman who says a lot of great stuff in our film. But after we finished our interview, he told me, it's really interesting here in the Great Lakes, sea lamprey are considered to be these villains, these ugly, horrible things. But in the Pacific Northwest, tribal communities there are building hatcheries to raise Pacific lamprey because they're highly endangered and they're an important part of the salmon ecosystem. And so I've been doing some research into that, and it's true. It's interesting how a species, when it's invasive, can become this arch villain. But actually, in the Pacific Northwest, Pacific lamprey are endangered, and people are trying to bring them back. Native communities, in the United States and First Nations in Canada have used them in traditional ceremonies since prehistory. And I'm a fly fisherman. I looked into doing some salmon fishing and some steelhead fishing up in the Pacific Northwest, and they fish with lamprey patterns up there. So anyway, it's a potentially interesting story that I'm starting to look in a little bit here. So
maybe you'd be the first person in history to do two separate award-winning films on different sides of the same issue there. But,
hide on lampreys over here. They're going to start to. Yeah. There's some very interesting stories up there too, just that catch my attention with the stocking and the history of rainbow trout in California, and then the steelhead fisheries in the Pacific Northwest are really in their own realm of saying we're done stocking, we're going to try something bold and crazy, we're going to try and manage for native wild fish. And I don't know enough about it, but you guys have some cool stuff going on up there.
The other thing that's interesting is they've taken the dams out of the Klamath River, which is just south of the California-Oregon border, and already the rebound in the runs up there is pretty impressive. So there's a lot of cool stuff going up in that area right now.
I love it. Well, Lindsey, if you ever want to come fly fish in Wisconsin, you know where to find us, fella. We'd love to take you in the boat.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. What about you, Marc? What do you mean? You mentioned Fish Pass a little bit. What else? What else is on your?
Yeah, Fish Pass is something that would be again worthy of its own podcast. It's just an amazing project, and we're also working on another big project is dam removal throughout the Great Lakes Basin. In terms of the pros and cons of that, there's a big project in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where they're talking about putting the rapids back in Grand Rapids, and it's really a cool story because there haven't been rapids in Grand Rapids for well over a century because of the dam there. But the dam is way out of date. It hasn't been maintained a long time, and it is going to get removed. And we've been working with the powers that be there to make sure that there would be a lamprey barrier put in. The lamprey barrier is an order of magnitude smaller than a dam, like a big dam like in Grand Rapids. So we could have a lamprey barrier that would still allow for the achievement of what they want. And it's these kinds of projects that I'm involved in because infrastructure is an important component of the Fishery Commission's program. I was thinking as well about continuing on with the oral histories that we're doing. They're very enjoyable to do, and I'm thinking about moving on to, as Lindsey said earlier in this podcast, there was a certain urgency to get folks who were had been involved in the program for many, many decades to get their stories while we still could. And frankly, we should have started this 20 years ago at least. But no time like the present. And it's also time then to move on to people who are earlier mid-career as well to get their stories so that future historians will not say, boy, I sure wish they had talked to them,
Right.
So I have every intention of continuing on with the history project, if nothing else, to get their interviews down and archive it. And who knows, maybe Lindsey will make a sequel. The Lamprey Chokers Next Generation. I don't know, whatever you want to call it.
We would be big fans. There's lots of different stories and quaggas and Asian carp, and I'm sure you could go on and on and on. Very cool.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. Yeah, definitely.
All right, fellas, last question. Final thoughts here. What gives you hope into the future? And then inversely, what keeps you up at night?
You can answer that however you want to. We meant it more around
towards
the Great Lakes.
Lampreys. Yeah.
You go ahead, Mark. I'll finish.
Well, what gives me hope is what we talked about earlier, and that is the really the strong. I'm again a political. I work in the world of politics, and I've really seen, even despite all that's going on right now, no wavering of the willingness to go to the mat to protect the Great Lakes and to restore the Great Lakes. And part of that is just because the Great Lakes are so ingrained in people's very being. That's why we live in this region, and it's impossible to separate yourself from that. And the politicians know it. Some, again, are motivated by economics and some by other things, but there's no wavering in that. So I walk away from Washington just very encouraged. Things that keep me up at night are the really banal things like budgets and making sure that Congress act and they actually finish those appropriation bills, or that someone will go through the effort to call the Secretary of Interior and make sure that they remind them that these people who are doing this work are vital to the $5.1 billion Great Lakes fishery. And I guess what kind of keeps me up is we do have a very strong support from society in general to restore the Great Lakes, and a respect for the outdoors and for the hunting and fishing heritage that's so important to our region. And I worry that over time, as people are less and less in the outdoors, that they slowly stop caring for it because it's not as personal to them. And that would be a tremendous shame, because we have a responsibility really to remain stewards for this tremendous resource that is so important to us.
Yeah, that is what keeps me up at night as well, Mark.
Amen. Yeah.
But for me, the thing about this story that I really like is that, we went through the pandemic, we did all this kind of stuff, and we heard how awful, we've been hearing how awful government is. We got to cut government. We got to do all this kind of stuff. And we hear how awful, especially during the pandemic, how bad science is, And so the neat thing about this story is that this is an example of nobody else could have taken on the sea lamprey problem than government could have. And it was scientists who came and really showed human tenacity and perseverance through this thing. This story is about people who wouldn't take no for an answer and never threw in the towel and said, hey, we can't do this. They kept going and kept trying and doing different things. And that this is about human perseverance and tenacity, but it's also about the fact that when nothing else is going to work, when no industry has enough money or nobody can get the consensus to spend the money from the private sector, the government is there for these kinds of problems, and it helps small towns where a lot of conservatives live, and it helps small towns that care that their economies are based on natural resources in the Great Lakes. It took government and science to solve this problem. And so hopefully, I'm hopeful about the bipartisan aspects of the Great Lakes, that people across the political spectrum understand, hey, yeah, we got to care about these things, and whatever it takes, we got to keep these things healthy. So that's what gives me hope, is the Great Lakes, I think, is a shining example of how people reach across political boundaries and all kinds of other divisions to say, whatever differences we have, this is what's really important here. And so let's do this. The Great Lakes is a great example of that I hope more people will see from this film, and from any curiosity it spurs that they'll come to the Great Lakes and see that actually in action. And then, what keeps me up at night is that, people, what Marc was saying, that young people are starting to live only through a little screen instead of getting out into nature. I'm inspired by you guys. Here's a couple of young guys that are getting their families out and connecting people to nature and getting people out in the outdoors and connecting them to the Great Lakes. That's awesome. I tip my hat to you guys. I hope you are influencing a whole lot of other people in your generation and in younger generations to go out and connect to the Great Lakes and understand what that brings to us, what being in nature does for a human being, to our souls and to our spirits and all those kinds of things. So good for you guys. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you very much for what you're doing, and I hope you spread the word far and wide. So
we will. That's very kind of you. And I'll honestly say to both of you gentlemen, when we were prepping for this podcast at the front end, it was exciting, and we're going to talk about this incredible project. And then obviously the cuts and the relationship with Canada came in, and it got very dire. And I expected, honestly, I didn't expect the worst, but asking Marc and Lindsey about the cuts and about the Canada relationship, I expected to hear lots of bad news. And I don't want to say that you painted over that. I think you told the exact honest truth about what's going on, and it gave me optimism. Mm-hmm. To what you just said, Lindsey, about government and science. You're talking about red states, blue states, swing states, Canada, U.S. That's awesome. I think that's the type of message we need right now in 2025. So thank you for instilling some optimism. It was really important.
Good.
But thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Especially to the both of you. You guys are very busy gentlemen. Marc just said he's been in Washington fighting the good fight. Lindsey's got more projects on the horizon, and to take an hour and a half plus to spend with us and our audience, it means a lot to us. So
well, thanks.
Really do appreciate it.
I was just going to say, I hope the audience will come, watch the film. It's on Apple TV. It's on Amazon Prime, Google TV. I think it's on YouTube. There's a whole lot of places. If they just search The Fish Thief or Great Lakes Mystery, I hope they'll go take a look at it. So.
We're going to link it in the bio. We're going to share it far and wide on our social media and email campaigns and all sorts of stuff. So
thank you.
We're going to make sure everybody watches it because it's a good one.
Well, thanks for having me as well on this. We're big fans of the podcast here in Ann Arbor, and so it's a thrill to talk to you both.
Oh, yeah. That's awesome.
Excellent.
That's awesome to hear. All right, guys. That's another awesome, truly one of our favorite episodes in the book of the Spot Bird podcast. Lindsey Haskin, Dr. Marc Gaden, your boys Dan and Bam Bam, over and out.
Okay.
Thank you.
Gentlemen.
Okay.
Thanks for tuning in to the Spot Burn podcast, brought to you by Musky Fool Fly Fishing Co. We're stoked to have you along for the ride. If you're fired up about the show and want to keep it blazing, share it with a friend. And don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Got a spark of inspiration, feedback, or just want to fan the flames of conversation? Head on over to muskyfool.com. We'd love to hear from you. Keep on burning and catch you on the water, y'all.